Hello. I'm going to do a bit of an introduction about how at Aspen Labs we view design thinking. So let's take a look and get started. So if you think about design thinking, kind of a perspective as, say, a bike maker, and if you were making bikes, how would you be thinking about that within your organization? It likely looks kind of something like this. You're thinking of the technicalities of, what kind of brakes are we using? How are we adjusting that? What are the rim and the tires that are new that we need to be evolving? The kind of seat, and there's various departments working on various things around making the bike, and you've got this sort of technical specification that goes around it. This is what it looks like when you're the organization and you're creating something. But if you're the user using that, it might look something like this, which is very different. This has the context in mind. This has the emotions that are involved in it, what the aspirations are, how those moments kind of come into fruition. And what's important about this is techniques like human-centered design or design thinking, and you'll hear me use those words pretty interchangeably in this conversation. That's where those kinds of methodologies really excel. Tim Brown, who used to be the CEO of IDEO, he talks about it like this: design thinking is a human-centered approach to innovation that draws from the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of people, the possibilities of technology, and the requirements for business success. And we're going to unpack each one of those a little bit, but the main point here is a human-centered approach to innovation. And why is having a human-centered approach important? People are complex creatures. Any of you that have ever been in a relationship with anyone knows that. There's what we say and what we do, and those things aren't actually always the same. If you've ever made a New Year's resolution, you know that what you say you might do as a New Year's resolution isn't actually what you always end up doing. Even more complex is really what we're thinking and feeling, and those always don't come out on the outside. So when we're talking about gathering information from our users, our customers, our stakeholders, and what we're looking for is what is it that they really want, often we default to surveying them, and what is it that they're going to say in surveys, and how will that guide us? But that unfortunately might not really be what they're thinking or what they're feeling. And so it's important that we have tools and processes and methods that actually help us pull that out. So getting back to what we were talking about earlier in the quote, so this unpacks really Tim Brown's quote in a different way. So in this Venn diagram are, if you were to boil down three very basic ways of entering into innovation, they could look something like this. They're starting off with, what is it from a technological standpoint that's actually feasible? What are we able to accomplish, to build, to do, to create? There's business viability. So what can we do that actually creates a new business? These are new business models and so forth. And then there are the human values. What is it that people are looking for? Often organizations come at it as a starting point from one of these three areas, depending on the approach of the organization, the culture, etc. What human-centered design approaches do is, at the end of the day, everything is important, no matter where your starting point is, technology, business, or human values. Real innovation really encompasses all of these things together. If you're taking a human-centered approach to it, you're starting off here. So you might not have the technology created yet. You might not have the business model or business plan created yet. You're beginning with, what is it that people are actually looking for? Let's start with that in mind. Along with this, there's a methodology. And the reason having a methodology is actually important is having a methodology in the way that you do something allows it to be teachable, repeatable, and scalable. And so that's why methodologies are important, as opposed to, well, this is just kind of how we work anyway. We ask people questions, we involve them. A methodology allows you to repeat it, to teach it, and to scale it within your organization. So in the work that my teams and I have done in the past, we've done a lot of work within Kaiser Permanente. These are just some sample examples of some of the types of things that we've applied human-centered design for. And as I said, when you might hear me use human-centered design and design thinking a bit interchangeably, often what you'll see are businesses that create products will often use design thinking as the terminology. Organizations that might be in the social sector space, the government space, healthcare, are more often using the term human-centered design. But those two things, in the way that we talk about it primarily, are interchangeable for the most part. So these are some of the things that we did in the organization. And when you actually get out into the field, it looks a little bit like this: how you're really learning and trying with the people who are actually receiving your services so that you're evolving it into the context of their lives, what they really need, and what's going to work for them. Why this is important is has kind of multiple sides to it. So one, you obviously want to create products and services that actually work for the people that you're trying to create them for, that might be buying them, that might be using them, etc. But also what's equally important is many times when we're creating these new products and services, it requires a new way of working within our own organizations or communities or governments, depending on what we're, where we're designing from. And so having those stakeholders, those people that are actually delivering them, to be a part of it, it's very important. So in this quote is from one of those stakeholders in an organization saying, you don't even know, it's so rare that people tell us why we're doing what we're doing. Usually they just say, here, this is what we're doing now. And it's even more rare that people ask us what we think about the idea and how we can work together to make it better. So when you think about changes that need to occur within organizations to deliver these new products or services, the people within those organizations, if they're not a part of the change, those organizations, those change efforts often fail. There's a McKinsey study that talks about 70% of all change efforts actually fail. And it's primarily due to a lack of understanding and then a lack of support from both the employees and the leaders within the organization. So utilizing these techniques helps to bring people along in the journey of not just what you're creating, but why you're creating it. This is an article in the Harvard Business Review that our team, when we worked at Kaiser Permanente, was featured in. And what I think is interesting about it is it's not just about the ideas themselves that were created, which were very powerful, but equally powerful is involving the people in the front lines that were actually delivering the care to be a part of creating that solution. The patients, in this example, the clinicians, doctors, nurses, etc. So now that we've talked a little bit about the why would you want to use human-centered design and design thinking, why would you want to do that? Let's talk a little bit about the what actually is it? And I'm going to unpack it from 3 standpoints: mindsets, methodology, and methods. Here's a visual that we use. And so I'm going to talk about each one of these, but you can see how they kind of hang together here of mindsets here going across the top. These are kind of a bundle of mindsets, not just in these particular areas of the methodology, but mindsets as a whole of what helps you do this work in a dramatically different way and working differently. A methodology, as I said, having methodologies in a process that's repeatable is very important, particularly for novices that are learning to do this differently. And then methods. There could be literally thousands of methods that could be listed here. But these are just sort of a sample of those of what helps to bring these things forward to actually do the work itself. So let's talk a little bit about mindsets to unpack that first. So if you look at mindsets with any of these, it's not going to be exactly the same. They're slightly different depending on the organization you're looking at. At Aspen Labs, we often will use these. The Stanford D School uses these, but there are some fundamentals that are the same. So some of the fundamentals that I wanted to call out are inclusion and empathy. The human side of things, empathy, understanding, bringing people together to do that. Along that same line, radical collaboration. So how do people really work together to create new ideas together, to create common understandings, to evolve ideas along the way? This being able to experiment, making things tangible, getting out of just using words into creating something that others can to look at, to touch, to review, to try out. That helps us get ideas out of our own heads and into the hands of our stakeholders so that they can interact with them and we can better understand what their needs are, evolve them, and make those work. And in order to do that, you have to share your work really early and often. You can't wait until you think it's perfect because it's highly unlikely that you're actually correct the first go around. So doing things really rough in tangible ways, but starting small and learning fast is very important in this approach. So you don't waste your time in doing something that actually your users don't find useful. So moving from mindsets into methodology, this is a viewpoint of several different methodologies just in terms of how they look. Different organizations, if you were to Google design thinking or human-centered design and images or methodology, you get a host of different visuals that are out there in the world. This is just a small little sampling. But just to let you know that even though you see different images to describe what it is, depending on kind of who's authoring that, there are certain fundamentals of each of these that are actually the same. So I want to unpack those for you a little bit. This is called the double diamond model. That's actually used in Europe quite a bit that I really like. So each of those models that we just showed here has these elements in it. So if you were to kind of take an engineering view and to peel back the colors, peel back the imagery, what's behind it? This is actually what's behind it. So two double diamond. So the first one is where it says finding the right problem. And then the second diamond is finding the right solution. Both of these things are very important and they're actually slightly different. So here we see finding the right problem, often called problem framing. A challenge that we have in business very frequently is that we jump into solving a problem before we actually really understand it. And so what happens is we're often solving the wrong problem. So in design thinking, we spend time upfront in finding the right problem, really framing up what the problem actually is that we need to be solving for. After you've done that, empathizing with your users, defining that problem, you get a refined problem statement of what you're actually trying to solve for that's meaningful for the people. Then you get into creating what those potential solutions might be, creating lots of ideas around them, prototyping and testing them. What makes this diamond shape is what divergence and convergence. I want to talk about that a little bit, about why do we even have that shaped that way. So diverge and converge really is a way of thinking, and you behave and act slightly differently depending on what phase of this double diamond process that you're in. So you see these divergent, it happens twice, convergence also does. So if you think about where you're beginning, with your effort, it begins with really thinking much more divergently. So that's when you're going out, you're empathizing with your users, you're gaining stories, you're gaining context, you're gaining understanding. You might be doing qualitative interviewing, you might be doing observations. There's lots of techniques that you might use. But basically here's when you're opening up what are the possibilities of what their needs are and what's important to them based on their context and their viewpoint of the world. So you need to be able to open up your thinking, and it might go many different directions that you didn't expect. Once you've done that, then you need to go through the process of sorting through all of that and saying, well, what's actually important of these things? What of these problems are we going to be focusing on? And how do we frame up the right problems for the right users? To do that, you need to be thinking in this sort of convergent way of making choices and whittling it down to what's important for us at this point in time and what are we going to be able to solve for. So that's when you get to the problem statement time point. Ideate, that's again when you start to open up the possibilities. Now that we know the problem that we're trying to solve for, what are the ideas that we have to help solve for that? That's when you're thinking more divergently again, and many different kinds of topics, approaches, tools, and methods to help us to think much more divergently and get out of our own creative ruts. So you've thought about all these types of possibilities. That's when then you need to start deciding, what am I going to prototype? What am I going to test? Begin to make choices, get critique from your stakeholders, and whittle down into what are you going to be moving forward with. So these phases are very important, and they're really important for teams to know where are you, and are you thinking divergently or are you thinking convergently, so that you're doing work in a way that's meaningful and productive with your team. So again, getting back to this image, you can see each one of these, when you look at the wording, understanding people, empathizing, etc., they all have that same basic flow in how they go through their process steps. The words might be different, but that double diamond, diverging and converging, all of that is basically the same behind all of them. So moving forward a little bit, so we've talked a little bit about the methodology. Now let's unpack a bit about getting into things more around the methods. So if we think about the methods, here's some examples of methods. There are many different options for methods that you can look at. Here when you look, there are some methods that are listed here that actually help us achieve these various points of time in the methodology. I'm going to go through some examples to give you a sense of what a method might be. This is AEIOU. This is a format about how you do observations. Here's one around qualitative interviewing and asking questions in more creative, open-ended ways. These are some brainstorm rules, and brainstorm rules you'll see all design thinkers use, which seems like a strange time to have rules, but that helps us get out of judging people's ideas, being critical at this point in time because we're thinking very divergently. So these rules help us to do that and set those norms around that. Also, which is kind of counterproductive, or it's counterintuitive, is brainstorming within constraints. So constraints actually help us to be more creative. So what are the constraints we're putting on ourselves? So for example, what ideas can you come up with that might cost $5? Or what ideas might have some sort of opposite effect to what we were thinking of? So these things will help you to get out of creating coming up with the same ideas over and over again. You might do something like, what ideas do we have that actually fit into a shoebox? But these brainstorming constraints to help us be more creative. Journey map is another method that's very common in design thinking. This particular one here was from the Smithsonian. And I think it's an interesting example because what a journey map does is it helps us to understand an experience from a user's standpoint. So let's say if we were the Smithsonian, this gray box that's here actually represents the Smithsonian Museum. So what we might be inclined to do is just think about, well, let's talk about what happens when people are in our building. What is that experience? And let's design to make that better. That's fine. But the reality of it is that your users, your visitors, have a much broader life that has implications of even if they make it to your building, what happens afterwards, et cetera. So what you can see here is they created the journey through the user's experience. So what are they looking at to even begin to think about? Are they going to go to the Smithsonian? What kinds of marketing materials are they getting? Who are they talking with? How are they planning their trip? What kinds of tools are they going to? How are they getting here into our building? What signs begin to direct them from, so let's say public transportation over to our building? And then they enter into our building. What's the experience that they're having here? Once they leave our building, what happens next? How do they get back into the world? How are they sharing their memories, et cetera? So this is a much more holistic way that actually lines up more with how your users, your customers are experiencing what your product or service is. So that's a journey map. Another method are lots of tools around prioritization, 2x2s, images like this that help us sort and sift through the number of ideas about what is it that we want to go forward with, how do we get out of sort of the spin of decision making and have these prioritization tools to help us comb through what direction we're going, what we think is successful, what are we going to fund, what are we going to pilot, et cetera. So now that we've got sort of a bit of a sense of some of these various different kinds of tools, I want to show you just a few examples of some things that are out there in the world to take a look at. Salesforce has a toolkit that's available. Take a look at that about what they're doing. Salesforce tool was leveraged off of the Center for Care Innovations, which is a nonprofit in California. So those things that's another great resource to go to about how they look at it. IBM has an enterprise toolkit that actually is open to people temporarily right now, so you don't have to, sort of have a registration to get into it. So take a look at what they do. They have some great videos and so forth to take a look at. Google Ventures has some tools. So while these aren't the sort of more traditional design thinking tools, the Design Sprint has many things that it leverages from. So this is a good one to take a look at. Also, IDEO.org has a human-centered design toolkit that's open to take a look at. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how we look at design thinking and how we talk about it and what that means to us. So, so take a look and get exploring. All right, thanks.